So welcome to the Freethinkers Living Sober Group's workshop on Varieties of Secular Experience, navigating AA in a secular way. We do this on the last Sunday of each month, and we have a different speaker or panel of speakers sharing their experience, strength, and hope for about 30 minutes, um, maybe a little longer sometimes, on some aspect of getting, staying, or living sober in AA in a secular way. The workshop is recorded, and we post the audio on our YouTube channel. You can check the chat for the links later. We'd also like to thank the Beyond Belief group for hosting us on the Zoom, on their Zoom channel, whatever whatever it's called. By the way, during the speaker portion, I do supposedly I turn off the chat functions. I don't seem to be able to do that. Um, hmm. It's only available during the question and answer portion. We also ask that you keep your microphone muted unless it's your turn to share, and use the raise hand function when we go to the sharing portion so we can call on people in order. You're welcome to ask questions of the speaker or share your own perspective, experience, etc. We do usually try and ask you to keep your comments to about 3 minutes or so everybody can have a chance to talk if they want to. I haven't asked anybody. Would someone care to do the little reading that we use today?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that Allie?
Yes, that's me.
Thanks, Allie.
Hey everybody, Allie, alcoholic.
Hi, Allie.
In AA, we are supposed to be bound together in the kinship of a universal suffering. Therefore, the full liberty to practice any creed or principle or therapy should be a first consideration. Hence, let us not pressure anyone with individual or even collective views. Let us instead accord to each other the respect that is due to every human being as he tries to make his or her way towards the light. Let us always try to be inclusive rather than exclusive. Let us remember that each alcoholic among us is a member of AA, so long as they declare. From Bill Wilson's 1965 address to the General Service Conference. Thank you.
As freethinkers, we aspire to open-mindedness and to appreciating the sharing of others, particularly those with whom we disagree. So we ask only that everybody share without attempting to dissuade or argue or disrespect anyone or their beliefs. And as a group, we're secular. That is, we don't endorse or oppose any system of belief, and we don't have any quarrel with a form of religion. We also don't use prayers of any kind in our workshops or meetings. Our only wish is to assure suffering alcoholics that they can find sobriety in AA without having to accept anyone else's belief or having to deny their own. And today's workshop features a discussion portion with Carl Eric Fisher, MD, about many of the issues that he covers in his recently published book, The Urge, Our History of Addiction. In case you haven't had a chance to read it yet, let me just say that The Urge illuminates the extent to which the story of addiction has persistently reflected broader questions surrounding being human and care for, connection with one another. He introduces us to people who have endeavored to address this complex condition through the ages: physicians, politicians, activists, artists, researchers, writers, and of course, the legions of people who have struggled with their own addictions, as has he. He also examines the treatments and strategies that have produced hope and relief for many people with addiction. And only by reckoning with our history of addiction, he argues, our successes and our failures, can we light the way forward for those who remain threatened by its hold. Joe C. and I will have a discussion with him for about a half an hour or so on questions like what the heck is heterogeneity of addiction, which he mentions in his book. Is there a continuum of so-called SUD from problem drinkers to akrasia? What's recovery? Does it mean total abstinence always? What about many paths to recovery and alcoholism myths? Those kinds of questions, or any that you have that you want to bring up. So without any further ado, Would you care to start us off with a little commentary, or just jump right into the discussion, Dr. Fisher?
I'll be very brief. Just in the way of introduction, maybe I could say just a few words about what brought me to the book and a touch
Great.
about my personal experience. So I want to say hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name's Carl. I'm an alcoholic. I identify as an alcoholic. That is an important identity for me. It's helped me a great deal in my own recovery. And it's really nice to be a part of a group that, as far as I understand, I'm looking forward to meeting you all, for whom this is really important. And uh, thinking deeply and practicing free thinking around the way we make sense of addiction and recovery has been life and death for me. And I assume from some of the little bit I've heard about your group, it's life and death for a lot of you too. So I'm really happy to be here and happy to be in conversation. And I'll just say briefly that I got interested in the history of addiction and generally the scholarly study of addiction because of my own struggles with denial, with making sense of my own identity. I was a drinker and a problem drinker really as far back as I can look, but I started to have problems more severely in medical school. In the very first year of residency, which is the specialized training after medical school, I really started having trouble controlling myself, where I was taking care of people with serious addiction problems and I was seeing their problems in myself. It even got to the point where rounding in the hospital as an intern, taking care of people with liver problems, I would sort of imagine that my own liver was aching and I was having trouble controlling my own intake. Even so, I still had blackouts and would sleep in, show up late. And despite the fact that I was in a really compassionate and caring residency program with faculty members that I had known for quite a long time, because I had also gone to medical school at Columbia, I felt like I really had to hide my shame and couldn't come forward and ask for help. To me, it felt at the moment, it wasn't really logical, but it felt at the moment almost worse than death to have to come forward and say, I'm struggling and I need help. So it got so bad because of that denial and concealment, that I had a pretty catastrophic bender, which led to a psychotic episode on stimulants like cocaine and Adderall, as well as alcohol. I wound up a patient in Bellevue Hospital in New York City. And then I got into, thankfully, at the time it felt constrictive, but in the end, I think it saved my life. I got referred to a physician health program in New York State where uh, uh, I voluntarily signed up for this program, then later chafed against it and said, "Oh, well, I don't really want to follow your treatment." And I got sent away to a rehab that, in my view, is a pretty ideological, old school rehab. There was a lot of talk about spirituality and a Judeo-Christian God, which was never part of my belief system. I was really attracted to Zen Buddhism and had practiced pretty seriously earlier in my life, precisely because I thought that it was compatible with a secular worldview, and that I didn't feel like there was a lot of real connection there. Although, a lot of the counselors were, I think, pretty respectful of that. Um, I think it was more ideologically driven in the sense that people at that rehab center said there's only one way that you can be addicted, and you have to do it this way, and you have to follow these steps, and all people with addiction are alike in the same way. And I already knew at that point in my training, despite the fact that people in medical school and residency get very little training about addiction, I already knew that some of the things that they were saying went against the best modern science that we have. So, long story short, we can talk more about it later. But long story short, I got out of rehab. I felt relatively stable in my recovery, but I still had a lot of questions swirling, like what actually had gone wrong with me, and how come things are so ideologically divided within mental health treatment, within psychiatry, within addiction in particular. And I got interested in the history and philosophy and sociology of addiction because it seemed like a useful way. It was a way in to a more synthetic and broad view of addiction, to make sense of, to look at how people have tried to make sense of this phenomenon over millennia, really. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I started off and I really wanted the answer. Like my idea was to write the definitive book of addiction. It was very arrogant. I thought, I'll figure it out myself because nobody else can seem to give a coherent synthetic account of addiction. So I'll do it. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized how contingent it was and how personal it was in my sense and how tied to my own history and my cultural legacy and how ideas about addiction were so powerfully shaped by cultural biases throughout time, that it really is my history of addiction. I call it our history of addiction because I do think addiction is universal and everybody has a little bit of it. But it's not my intention to. That's why I wrote and incorporated bits of memoir in the book, is that it wasn't my intention to pronounce anything definitive. It was rather to say, this is the best I can do for myself. This is the book I needed for myself to make sense of my own addiction. These are things that are helpful to me. I hope they're helpful to other people too. So yeah, once again, it's really nice to be here. I don't want to take up too much time because I see there's a lot of people on the call and you mentioned you had some questions, guys. So I look forward to talking.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. By the way, I just want to say I really recommend this book. I don't always, but I found it very informative and a lot different than some of the other. It wasn't a history of AA, by the way. You should know that. There is some AA history, but it's not really the focus. Joe, do you have any questions you'd like to start off with?
Well, just while we're recommending, carlericfisher.com is a great site for links and things. And also, I would...
Podcast.
Yes, I'm a big podcast fan. It's a big part of my life. And Flourishing is Carl's podcast, and it's wonderful. It's a sort of podcast that you probably want to listen to each of them twice. My computer and my iPhone aren't synced up, so sometimes my phone thinks that I haven't listened to this one yet, and I go, oh, I remember that, and I go, oh, good, yeah, I like this one. and I think it's delightful. But maybe I'll just start off with a question, because we haven't talked for some time. So your book came out, busy. You even say in your podcast that you've been a little slow on putting out new episodes because you've been on everybody else's podcast. And I understand that. But your intro, you said you were searching for answers. You say that in the introduction of your book. You became an addiction medicine specialist. You searched psychology and neuroscience and history and literature and everything else, the academics and policymakers. Did you read Never Enough by Judith Grisel, I think the name is, about her
Yeah, I did.
life in neuroscience, and her frustration of going into it like 25 years ago, thinking, I got this, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and not being there yet. Do you have some of that feeling?
A little bit. I think, I wrote in the intro that part of my motivation in my broader career path, even before I entered recovery and even before I focused more specifically on an addiction, was some disillusionment with some aspects of modern neuroscience. I went to high school and then started college. And in college, I did basic neuroscience research. I did molecular neuroscience, studying genetics and how they interacted with neurotransmitter systems. So I was really interested in basic functioning, and I thought maybe that would lead the way. But even by the 90s, which was George H.W. Bush's decade of the brain, I think there was already a realization that in 1990 and 2000 and 2010 and 2020, we don't know enough to have a clockwork mechanistic description of how the brain works. That was really popular even in the 2000s, and I think it was fading by the 2010s, that people would say, well, this is the center of this, and then it interacts with the center of that. And there's still a bit of that, but even in popular science and definitely in academic science, I think people recognize that sort of phrenological, is sort of like neophrenology, that to say that one part of the brain interacts with another part of the brain. So, when you talk about Judy Griesel and Never Enough, I can identify with her sense of disillusionment, but for me, I don't even think I had that. I didn't even have that sort of aspiration that, oh, maybe neuroscience by itself will have all the answers to addiction. I think one of my current frustrations is a difficulty in thinking across systems and across levels, because I still love neuroscience and I still love medical science. There's a lot there, and simultaneously, when we get too reductionistically focused on just the nuts and bolts, we miss out all of those other levels that are so important: psychological, environmental, social, cultural, and so forth. And a lot of times, even today, neuroscientists like to say, well, this is the fundamental, this is the most important, this is the primary. Well, it's not. It's more like a dynamic interlocking web, in my view, than
So would you say then the idea that it's just a brain disease? Can you speak to that at all?
yeah, I don't like the notion of brain disease. I understand that a lot of people really identify with, including people in my own community, my own recovery communities and so forth. There are a lot of people who really get a lot from the disease label. And I think that the word disease has been used in a lot of useful and good ways, especially as I describe in the book, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when there was a lot of stigma against addiction. It was so crude at that point that it's almost like notions of disease were needed to burst open the doors of hospitals and advocate for insurance coverage and advocate for a more compassionate view of addiction. But disease is such a messy word that I think even in the same piece of writing, but people can use it in different ways. They can, in one stroke, they can say, oh, diseases generally means that, yes, there are biological components to the problem of addiction, and yes, that medicine has a role to play in the treatment of addiction. But then it can also be used, and has very often been used, to say that medicine is the best, biology is the best, the brain overall else. And there are also really dangerous, pessimistic, and I would say even dehumanizing notions wrapped up in that people have used the brain disease notion recently, and then they've also used it in the 1920s, and they've also used it in the 1840s and so forth and so on, to say that people with addiction are broken, they can never change. Once an addict, always an addict. They can never reform in any meaningful way. And I just think that it's that messiness and that sort of lack of clarity that makes me worry about the disease notion.
You used a phrase that I thought was an interesting phrase: heterogeneity of I can't remember of addiction, I guess it was. Do you want to speak to that at all? What that even means?
Yeah, it was. So the chapter that comes up for me was toward the end, where I was trying to make sense of myself. So in early recovery, the question that was alive for me was, what does it mean? I was in early recovery and I wasn't drinking, and I was saying, okay, I'm probably far enough out on the spectrum that I have a problem and I shouldn't drink again. But what does that actually mean? What kind of problem is it that I have? And there have been so many stories about addiction, like so many simplistic one-liners about addiction, like all addiction is the cause of genetics, or all addiction is necessarily caused by trauma, or all addiction is necessarily caused by bad choices, or so forth and so on. And my best read on the literature, in the academic and scientific literature today, is that there's no one cause of addiction. And when we dumb it down and simplify it in that way, it's not helpful. I think we probably underestimate trauma, for example, and that's why so many people are interested in trauma. And we as a medical profession need to do a better job of addressing trauma. But to reduce all addiction to the notion of trauma, like, waters down the concept and makes it difficult. Not to make it all about trauma, but just as one example, that as long as people have studied addiction, going back to this fascinating German doctor who went to Moscow around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, Karl von Bühl-Kramer, people have had the intuition that there are different types of people with addiction. Some people seem to have more of like a quote unquote functional addiction, where they can present as together to the outward world even while their life is falling apart. I was sort of like that up until the point that I wasn't. Other people are more binge style, where they can have long periods of abstinence before a really catastrophic binge, and then other people are more ready and steady and regular. Whether or not those, one word for those things is typologies, whether or not those typologies really hold up over time is an open question as far as I'm concerned. But at least what we can say is that there are many different causes and conditions. And for some people, genetics does play a really strong role. And other people, maybe not a strong role, and it's more environment, early childhood environment. And other people, maybe it's more because they have some sort of comorbid psychological problem, like anxiety, or even a major mental disorder like bipolar or schizophrenia or something like that. Who knows? But there's been part of the reason I think that heterogeneity is an important notion is because there's been at various points such an urge to reduce addiction to just one simple story. And in doing so, we often oversimplify it to the point where the sort of one size fits all prescription winds up leaving a lot of people behind. It's overkill for some people. It's not enough for others. And we do better to be more humble about what we actually know about where it comes from and how to take care of it.
Joe, did you want to?
Yeah, I blame TED Talks for that, and I think that's maybe unfair. But limiting people to 17 minutes for complicated issues, you get the idea that the opposite of addiction is connection. Now that in a complex, it's part of that, but I had plenty of connection in the crack house and plenty of connection in the local bar. I needed people who modeled pro-social behavior before, and made sobriety recovery look good, like they were living like cool lives and still had sex and rock and roll at least, so I had to see that before I would even consider it, right? And that is from connection, but there can be good connection and bad connection. Yes. But that I would love simple definitions that we could all agree on. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Not in secular AA.
Not anywhere.
One of the quotes that I used on the flyer, or a quote I used on the flyer, had to do with this idea of alcoholic personality or addictive personality. A friend of ours, Beth H., wrote a book called Not All Alcoholics Are Egomaniacs, which was a fun read. But I liked that quote. Do you want to expand on that at all, about what you meant by that?
Sure. Yeah, let me pull up the quote. I'm not going to read extensively here, but the upshot, and a lot of this comes from Bill Miller's work and others. Today, we know there's no singular addictive personality. There's no consistent set of personality dimensions or defensive structures that separate people with addiction from the rest of society. And one reason that's really important is because the notion of personality was weaponized in the 1930s, 1940s. This is a time that the historian David Courtwright has called the classic era of narcotic control, where the United States was actually somewhat receptive to therapeutic and compassionate approaches to addiction. And then there was a massive backlash as the pendulum swung in the other direction around the time of alcohol prohibition, and then also the prohibition of cocaine and opioids and more in the 1920s. And so in the 1930s, a lot of if you're into history, this character, Harry Anslinger, famously profiled in Johann Hari's book, and then many others, as sort of the godfather of the governmental agencies, which would eventually evolve or devolve into the DEA. And he was a real master of spin. He was a real spin doctor. And this was also not coincidentally a time when American media was really kicking up, and radio, and then magazines, and then mass media. And he loved this notion of addictive personality, which came from legitimate research and people who were trying to be very open-minded and compassionate about understanding addiction. But then Harry Anslinger said, all addicts are psychopaths, which means they're bad, they're broken people, they're irredeemable. And they're all the same. So there's no cure for addiction. The only cure is lock them up and throw away the key. We need to just essentially just warehouse them. And then maybe if we punish them enough, they'll get the message and at least they'll stop bothering us. And so that message, that notion of an addictive personality has a tremendous staying power in our culture, and then was also picked up by the treatment industry in certain ways. In some cases, in some bad examples, profiteering treatment industry efforts to convince people that they were broken in a particular way, that they needed the treatment industrial complex's profits or products. And so, the personality matters. There are ways that people, whether through genetics or early childhood environment or otherwise, do have something like a temperament where they have a type of tendency of a reactive style, whether they're sort of anxious or maybe impulsive. And those different flavors of personality can certainly play into addiction for sure. Bill Wilson himself, I think, described it. He was big on describing his own anxiety and how that played into, predisposed him to, worked hand in hand with, was inseparable from his own experience of addiction. But it's not always the case with everyone. So I think it's important to dispel the notion of personality, because it's yet another route into what we were talking about earlier. It's just another route toward dumbing down the notion of addiction to use it for various unhelpful purposes.
What do you see as like the next frontier for recovery medicine, recovery communities?
Yeah, there's a lot that's hopeful that I see, at least. I truly didn't get hardly any education about addiction in med school, and I got some in psychiatry training, but I got very little on recovery, meaning that there's a lot of focus on problems and how to remediate problems, but not a lot about what comes next and how do we work toward flourishing, which is why, thank you for your kind words at the beginning, by the way. That's why I named the podcast Flourishing After Addiction, is because that was my own interest. It's okay, what's next? And like a lot of people in recovery know, committing to abstinence is it's like signing up for the marathon. And then the question becomes, what next? And even more personally, when I was in this supervised doctor's program, we signed a 5-year contract where we said, please help us for 5 years. And the doctor program would supervise us. We'd have a worksite monitor, do random urine tests and so forth and so on. And at the end of that 5-year period, I saw so many people relapse, and it was really scary. As soon as, and this is, after 5 years of abstinence, people can do really well. They rebuild their medical practice, they reintegrate in the community, they have a lot of strengths, a lot of supports, a lot of even sources of joy in their life. But then absent that external structure, a lot of folks went ahead and relapsed. And, I thought to myself, like, what? I know I'm getting away from, I'll come back around to the next frontier in a second, but I had asked myself, like, what is going to actually make me, excuse me, I got a little cough. What is going to actually keep me from relapsing, in the sense of, when I get to that 5-year mark, I want to not want to relapse. And to me, that was inseparable from the sort of bigger picture questions of recovery, like how do I work toward meaning and purpose and flourishing, and actually replace the substance use with something that is working for me, both in the sense of working toward the positive, but also working with pain and difficulties in my life. And I think that, to me, is one of the most hopeful next frontiers in research and also medical practice, is to be more attentive toward the recovery side of the coin. Some of you will know there's this sort of hot new field of research that people have termed recovery research. In a way, it's been around for decades and decades and decades. It was just sort of marginalized because the findings of recovery research, or what you might call recovery research, in the 70s and 80s kind of went against accepted dogma about the way addiction was supposed to work. And so, nowadays, John Kelly is an endowed professor at Harvard studying recovery research, and there are many other academics studying, what do people's lives in recovery actually look like? What are the factors that help them not just maintain abstinence, but also work toward flourishing and so forth? And I think we see that in medicine too. We see that in medicine and psychotherapy, and even the way our health systems are sort of organized. The last thing I'll say about it is, even at the level of policy, Nora Volkow, who people have complicated opinions about, and I think is generally a force for good and a really thoughtful person. Nora Volkow recently wrote an opinion piece where she, in a somewhat roundabout way, argued for changing our yardstick of what is success in the study of addiction. The yardstick for success in most scientific trials was just abstinence. Does someone drink, or do they not drink? Do they relapse? But what if we looked at these bigger picture factors, like like relationships, like happiness and well-being, like social connectedness, all the things that you might call recovery capital. So I think there's a raising, excuse me, on the scientific frontier, and certainly in the more sort of open-minded and forward-thinking clinicians, there's attention to that, and that's one of the things that really makes me excited for the field.
That's interesting. One of the things that came up for me in reading your book, and I've been thinking about this sort of continuum of what's now called substance use disorder, and that there's I think it's a Greek word, akrasia, that really fits me. But I think one of the things that I've noticed over my 40 plus years in AA is there's this tendency to think that anybody who comes to AA is an alcoholic, and the only solution for them is abstinence, and they have to do it. But I'm not sure that's always accurate. So I guess and there's support for that, for those who care, in the big book as well. Although it doesn't seem to be the myth that persists. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you think about what actually how can we even define, if we can, and sort of, since we're all so in favor of reductionism, how do we define something like recovery? And does it necessarily include abstinence? I mean, the very thing that you were just bringing up.
Yeah, I don't know is the ultimate answer. And recovery can mean so many different things in different contexts, whether we're talking about someone's personal identity as they work in a mutual help group to try to help themselves and help other people, versus studying it in a clinical or scientific way, versus an even third level is at the level of policy, when, say, national organizations have to come up with a definition of recovery, say, for example, to make decisions about where they give funding, like what counts as a recovery community organization. And those are very complicated, and I could even see different definitions of recovery making sense in different contexts. For me, it comes up for me most commonly with patients, where they ask, a lot of people have a substance use problem. They resolve it somehow or another, maybe medications, maybe psychotherapy, maybe mutual help groups that might or might not include AA. And then they might ask themselves, what counts as recovery? I'll estimate, because otherwise I'll get the stat wrong, but I cite in the book that there's something like 40 million people in the United States who, when asked in a survey, will say, yes, I've resolved a problem with substances. And then about half of those people say they're in recovery. And then even so, that's a lot. It's 20 million. And then I think it works out to like roughly 10% who have resolved the problem, and roughly 5% who say that they're in recovery. And then even fewer of those people who say that they're in recovery regularly go to a mutual help group. So within those millions upon millions of people, they certainly have different definitions of recovery. But for me, seeing patients, my question is really, what is supportive of somebody's work toward meaning, purpose, flourishing, stopping harm to themselves, stopping harm to other people? And so I really am a big fan of an umbrella view, a very broad umbrella that says, any positive change, as long as somebody is, as long as it means something to the person themselves, because who am I to say you're not in recovery if you're trying, however you're trying, it doesn't matter how you're trying. If you're trying and then you relapse periodically, but you're still showing up, you're still working, you're still trying to make a change. And for that reason, I know in some recovery groups, people say, rather than saying, I have 18 years sober, they'll say I have 18 years in recovery. It was actually Owen Flanagan, the Duke University philosopher, who mentioned that to me first, or I might have read it in his work first. And that makes it a little more, whether or not you've had continuous years of sobriety in there, like even if you've had continuous years of sobriety, it's a way of communicating to other people, like your recovery is valuable and your efforts are valuable too. So yeah, I hesitate to say like this is the way it should be. It's not a hill I'm interested in dying on in terms of like getting into a big fight. And I think with a lot of these psychological concepts, as I've learned in bioethics broadly, it pays to be flexible and pragmatic, such that in one context versus another, we might have to think flexibly about our definitions. But I really like the notion of positive change, any positive change.
To what extent is this flexibility in definitions hard to have a ranking system or to measure the treatment industry and that sort of thing? Is that problematic that recovery or effectiveness can be defined in so many different ways?
I do think it is, because like any other buzzword, recovery is not a buzzword to me. It's very important to me, but if you're glib with it, it can easily become a buzzword. But like many other buzzwords, you can slap on the label and say this is a recovery-oriented system of care, just because you read somewhere that it's nice to call things a recovery-oriented system of care. In the same way that I care very deeply about meditation and mindfulness. It's a big part of my clinical practice, as it is for a lot of other people who study it very seriously. But then when people are sort of like typing up the description of their care programs, they can very easily say, oh yeah, mindfulness-oriented treatment is offered here because we'll do a 5-minute meditation before we have a group psychotherapy program. So, we have to be careful about that. And honestly, this is really difficult, backbreaking work when we're talking about sort of accreditation and regulation. There are groups like Shatterproof and others. There are national organizations that are interested in asking the question, how do you actually compare different types of treatment, different types of offerings meaningfully against each other? What is a reasonable standard of care? Because everyone always says we need more addiction treatment, and that's absolutely true. It's vastly underfunded. We don't have anywhere near enough substance use disorder providers, and we also need way better treatment. We need much better treatment. And there's so many shady profiteers and people offering really just actively harmful supposed treatments. So that's one of the big paradoxes, is like, as we scale up, how can we make sure it's really quality treatment too? So I don't know. I feel like that, Joe, I feel like that was sort of like an elaborate dodge where you asked me how do you define it, and I say I have no clue. But it's I almost think that's like, I'll leave that to the people who are really into operationalizing a policy. I think if I really had a heart for that, I would be in DC doing like think tank work. But it's tough. It's tough stuff.
Okay. Joe, can we go ahead and open it up, or did you have?
Yeah, I was when I asked the last question, I was about to say to you, I could do this all afternoon, but let's see what other people have to say.
Pardon me. I think that's a good idea. And we'll do it with the raised hands. And we already have one raised hand. So, Kathy, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself. There
Yes. Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm an alcoholic. Thinking back on my history, I used to kind of accept the fact that I was born into alcoholism. My father's an alcoholic, my brother's an alcoholic, my nephew's an alcoholic. And so I thought there was some mystical gene that I carried that would make me into an alcoholic. I think it's more nuanced now, because I didn't drink until I was in my early 30s. You know, I went through high school, I went through college, I worked after college for 5 years, and then I went back to school. But all that time, I really never drank. I never hung out with people who drank. And then there was a complex series of events that I think got me to the point of becoming an alcoholic. And that was, number one, I was, when I was a student, I was very poor. I went to medical school. And when I was in medical school, I didn't have enough money to get a winter coat in Michigan. And so the thought, especially since I hadn't been introduced to any kind of regular drinking except at home, the thought of buying a bottle of booze was a useless, use of my money. For a bottle of booze, I could take the bus to school instead of getting cold in my spring coat. And I moved from Ann Arbor, Michigan, to Detroit to go to medical school. And I only knew one person there. And that one person introduced me to a whole group of people who met at the bar every night. And so I started to become a regular drinker, not yet an alcoholic, but I did enjoy my drinks. And then in medical school, I got into my third year of medical school. And as you know, that's the year when you start doing clinical work. And then I did a residency in internal medicine. That to me was a huge trauma in my life. I never really realized what I was getting into. I hated the medical care system. I was left on my own a lot to do things I was not capable of doing. And when that happens, for me, it was a huge trauma. I also had compassion, So those things together, being able to buy a bottle of booze, meeting a lot of people who drank, and then the trauma of medical school, I think they all converged at the same time. And I took off very quickly from there to become a daily drinker. So I don't think of it just in terms of genetics anymore. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate that. I forgot to mention, please remember this is being recorded. And if you'll keep your comments to, 3 or 4 minutes, if you see me doing this, it means you probably need to wrap it up. And the chat is also open if you would like to use that. And we always aspire to open-mindedness and to appreciating the sharing of others. So please try not to argue or dissuade or try and disrespect anybody. I'm sure most of the people here have heard all this before and wouldn't do that kind of thing. Tim.
I'm Tim. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Tim.
With a background of 5 years of abstinence from alcohol and other drugs. I would like to commend the doctor for this wonderful book. It is a very pleasant read in that it gives you that background of some of the history of addiction, but it also gives you his wonderful own success story in finding recovery. And I would also commend the term flourishing and the podcast. I've only listened to 2 or 3 of those. My question kind of centers around this whole, I know we cannot make everything fit one size fits all definition of recovery, but we have this long-standing lack of well-defining success and knowing what flourishing is. We had that even with Bill Wilson talking about emotional sobriety in his latter years. And we had Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, in 1995. So we've had this progression of understanding of flourishing. I'm particularly interested in how the doctor managed to avoid relapse at that 5-year mark. How did you find this flourishing, and how do we all do that? What is the right treatment model for ourselves to avoid that crazy brain to slide into denial and slide back into reuse? And even your book could somewhat give you that perspective when you think about, alternative aspects of recovery, that some recovery for some might include some occasional use. How do you avoid that craziness of denial? Thanks.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you for the kind words. It means a lot. Excuse me. I don't know. I would hate to put myself out there as some sort of model of flourishing, because it's not true. Just earlier today, I had an enormous slice of my son's birthday cake. I probably shouldn't have another. My doctor told me my cholesterol is high, but I probably will. And it's got a really nice lemon buttercream frosting around it. And, I'll leave it for another day. And I've had struggles with anger. Anger has felt very addictive to me in sobriety, and choose your point. Could go on for, there's a million ways to lack emotional sobriety. But for me, I'll just say the thing that I think helped me by the time I got to 5 years was, first off, having a real community, both a community in recovery and also a community in what I consider a spiritual practice, which is Zen Buddhism. It became more religious for me over time, even though for me it's not a metaphysical or sort of supernatural type of belief system. There still is belief, there still is faith, there still is ritual. It's very complicated. A philosopher named Evan Thompson wrote a really great book on Buddhism called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, about the religious but not metaphysical aspects of spirituality. So I'll just kind of sidebar that a little bit. And it was going to psychotherapy and working from multiple angles. When I read the stories of people in recovery who had really flourished and done well, I think a lot of them, they had a recovery community, and they also had something like a spiritual practice, and they also got the outside help they needed. And even then, a lot of them struggled and caused harm and had problems. But at least those types of additional supports and connections were really helpful. And out of the community comes service, right? The opportunity to show up for others, and even just to show up and carry the lineage forward, whatever that lineage might be. All of that was really important to me too. So those are just some thoughts about what I think maybe helped me to stop harming, and I think helped prevent me from relapsing. But I think it can be different for a lot of different folks.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. By the way, one of the people we had on our here was a friend of mine, Kevin Griffin, who wrote One Breath at a Time. And there's also an interview or a podcast with Dr. Fisher on his site for anybody who's interested in that. Neil.
Thank you. I'm Neil. I'm a drunk that don't drink. And first off, I'd like to thank you, Carl, for being here. I've picked up a few good items for myself. And I haven't read your book, but I intend to. It's a couple of things that have been mentioned that I'd like to put my opinion on in my 3 minutes here. And one is addictive personality, and that's been thrown around a few times. And just in my opinion, of course, I think it's a bad label. I really do. I think if you wanted to use it, and some people do still, you can pick it up, if you will, in your teenage years when you started with nicotine and beer and a few other things. And all of a sudden, what does that do? That label gives you the label, you must have an addictive personality. I don't know. I really don't know. If you are someone who eats chalk and loves chalk and you can't stop eating chalk, have you automatically been given a addictive personality? I don't know. I think another word that's in here that I think has been mentioned too over my 35 years, and I'll be 36 years of accepted sobriety next month, is denial. And how, of course, the medical profession is continually lied to about what people are telling them and concerned of what's traumatizing their life and why they can't get on, because they lie to them all the time or most of the time. So, and consequences be damned, consequences be damned. The peer pressure kind of works both ways, I think. I mean, we do it in school. Here we come into AA, and what we hear and in our speakers, with some of us walk away and say, no, there's a fellow that has is strong peer pressure for the rest of us. So I'm getting more and more away from stabilized conversation and seeing so many possibilities to other things, such as our styles of drinking and addiction. That's about it. And I'm satisfied with it all. I didn't get the first jump in. It took me, after a year, I went right on drinking. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me. He gave me 34 more years of living in sobriety, and some of it hasn't been pretty. Anyway, thank you kindly very much.
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate that. Well, Jeb.
Thank you, John. My name is Jeb, and I'm a grateful recovered addict alcoholic. And thank you so much for coming here to Carl and sharing your perspective. And I look forward to reading your book, because when I was in college in my 40s, it was a few years of sobriety, I had a professor who said, when we're dealing with addiction, we're dealing with a multivariate problem, and therefore we need multivariate solutions. And this is what I like about what's happening across the medical field these days, and addiction field, is we are looking at many things that can work together or work separately from others. And I know in my years, I've taken to reading the Daily Stoic. That helps to calm me in some ways, and other things, and the Eightfold Path of the Noble Truths and the various other parts of Buddhism. But my thing is, I've always tried to incorporate other things into my 12-step life, living the 12 steps. And I never run into any contradictions, unless I insist upon the idea that there's a sky goddess, some magical being out there someplace that gives a crap about what's going on in the world or in my life. I have no evidence in it. But I had a wonderful sponsor in Montana who said, this is when I've had probably 8 or 7 years sobriety, says you need to quit hiding behind the big book. You need to be telling precisely how it works for you. And that has served me well in my years of working as a therapist and as a sponsor, and working with myself to just stay on the track and keep digging deeper into the things that could lead me to, well, I don't like that word relapse, but to use again. But, I always introduce myself today as an addict alcoholic, because I was in AA for quite a while before I saw that I wasn't just an alcoholic. I was dependent on other substances. It took me 10 years to get rid of nicotine until I realized that it was controlling my life. It took a few more years for me to realize that I was self-medicating with food and other things over the list. And the process that Bill set down, as long as I'm willing to incorporate other things like your research and ideas and so forth, really works very well for me. So I could talk forever, but I know that isn't accepted. So today is day 15,982, one day at a time. And see, that's what kept me sober 2.5 years before I came to my first AA meeting. I had found the power of self-efficacy, or whatever it is, to say no to some things. And the first thing was alcohol. so that I didn't have that numbing my feelings and my thoughts. So it seems to work, and it works in different ways. I'm still waiting for Joe C. or someone to write a book called The Varieties of Recovery Experience. But I mention that as often as I can. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeb. Yeah. Janice.
I'm Janice. I'm an alcoholic. Yes, I'm glad you're here, Dr. Fisher. You know, when I look at genetics, yes, I have alcoholism in my family on my mother's side. However, it can't all be genetics because neither my mother or her sister or one of my cousins has ever had problems with alcohol, and I didn't grow up with it, and I started drinking, and it took me 10 years to go over the line. So there's got to be something else involved. What I think is involved for me is I've been depressive since I was preteen, and and not medicated for a long time because there wasn't anything out there I could take that didn't have awful side effects. But I know there has to be more than that. But what runs in my family is mental illness, and it gets worse every generation. I have 4 cousins. I have one cousin that's a functioning human being. I wasn't around any of them for a long time, and so I didn't know this for a long time. But I have one cousin that she and I feel like, we won the lottery there. We have depression, but we don't. His sister's bipolar, a brother who's bipolar, a brother with anger issues. None of these people are functioning, and their children aren't functioning. And God, I don't know what's going to happen with the grandchildren. It's very sad. I mean, my solution to that was not to have any kids. And I said, I'd like to take these genes out of the gene pool. I don't think they're healthy. But it's always that argument about nature and nurture, and I still think it has to be a combination of it. I can't come down on one side or the other because people are too complicated, and you're right, we do not understand the brain. I'm not sure we ever will. And that's all I've got.
All right. Thanks, Janice. Marcus.
Hi, I'm Marcus, and I'm an alcoholic. Carl, thanks so much for coming on. I haven't read your book, but I really want to. I guess as a way of self-disclosure, I always feel like I need to come out. I'm a clinical psychologist. I also do neuropsychology work. I'm a member of IDAA, and I go to Caduceus meetings at times. And I say this, and Carl, partly I want to give you a lot of praise. In my experience, healthcare providers get maybe an extra scoop of shame. A lot of alcoholics feel such intense shame. And I know in my own story, I've just felt such shame that I'm a healthcare provider and I'm an alcoholic. And that's really been a stumbling block. So as you were talking, there were a lot of things that I was thinking about. I mean, I can become very intellectual about addiction. And I kind of like the idea of risk factors, and just sort of as you were talking about the complex nature of the brain, that there's just no one addict, and that addiction can look really, really different amongst us. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I heard this in a meeting recently, is looking at any positive change. So in psychiatry and psychology, we like to use the word impairment of functioning. It's in the DSM. It's kind of how we look at all these mental disorders. And I was thinking, what a difference thinking about recovery and trying to get sober from any positive change versus impairment of functioning, which is a much more negative way of looking at it and thinking about it. So I really like this. I have 18 years in recovery, or I have, 18 days sober. That kind of difference, I think, could be really, really helpful. Yeah, I think that's it. I just really got a lot out of your talk and all the comments that everybody's made. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Derek. Are you there, Derek? In Dublin. Maybe we'll come back. Nancy Ann?
Hi, I'm Nancy Ann, an alcoholic in recovery.
Hey, Nancy Ann.
Well, there are a couple of things on my mind now. I went back to school at one point and got a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I was 5 years sober, and I found myself to be in great demand because there was this magic combination of an advanced degree and sobriety, and so I was kind of thrown right into a treatment program that when I look back on it was sorely lacking. And the thing that really got me, and that still does get me, is how many people we had to turn away because they didn't have insurance. So I decided that I would go on the front line and get a job where that wasn't the case. And I went to work for a program run by the Salvation Army that was in a very poor part of town here in Kansas City. It was in Kansas City, Kansas, downtown. And my clients were dual diagnosis. They were coming out of the penitentiary. Some of them had never had a job per se. They had made their living by thieving or conniving or whatever. But the two things that really bothered me there were a lot of things that bothered me. One of them was the fact that there is, psychotherapy, I think, is really an important part of recovery for a lot of people, including myself. And yet, if you don't have money or proper insurance, in fact, most insurance doesn't want to pay for psychotherapy, then you're kind of up the creek on your own. And there are millions of people out there like that who really need help and who are not getting it, even if they want to get it. And the same is true, I think you're saying, when you were speaking of treatment programs. I think by and large, a lot of them really are horrible. They're really not doing a good job at all. And there hasn't been much advancement that I can see in the way treatment programs are run. I mean, there should be by now a much better way of handling people in treatment. And sometimes I do think, picking someone up out of their life and putting them in a structured, protected environment is really good. Providing the treatment is good. So, I mean, I'm kind of going around in circles here. But what I'm saying about our country is that there are just a lot of people in need who don't get help. And the end result frequently is disaster. Either they hurt themselves or they hurt somebody else. There's suicide, so forth. We have as far as, in my estimation, we have a long way to go in learning how to deal with people who have addictions. And as you said, there are addictions to many things, not just alcohol and drugs. And in my instance, the family is rife with alcoholics. They're everywhere.
Can you wrap it up, Nancy Ann?
Yeah, sure. And so it's not surprising that I wound up that way. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Derek, let's try again. Well, I'm not hearing you. Okay, Brendan.
Thanks a lot, John. Hi, I'm Brendan, alcoholic. Thanks, John and Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot, Carol. It was really nice listening to everything you said, and I loved the interaction that John, Joe, and yourself had as well. And thank you very much for taking the time to respond to me. I apologize here as well for sending the messages when I didn't realize we were doing it this way. Anyway, I'm one of those, I think I was probably born with an inherited vulnerability, being Irish and of Catholic parents definitely helped. But I did love everything that you said this evening about, the causes. I had heard it before, but the way you summed it and summarized it, it was really good. I just really wanted to just say thank you so much. I've loved everything that you said, and I've made some notes. I generally tend not to make notes when I'm listening to people, but I did this evening. And there's one other thing that you've reminded me of. Right throughout my life, before I had a drink, anybody who was teaching me, presenting me anything, I thought that they were always taken out of a little box, that every part of their life was perfect, and that at the end of the day, the teacher or whoever it was would be put back into the box and until the next day. And when you were speaking, I'd say subconsciously I felt the same thing probably. Something I must admit to that. I've got problems, but people who might have problems are better at dealing with them than I am. But where you really helped me as well this evening was when you spoke about your own personal situation, maybe eating the extra slice of cake, and especially when you talked about being quick to anger. I would go to meetings in London and Ireland, and I would share my experience. And at the end, sometimes people would say, "Oh, we like listening to you. You've got a soft voice and you sound very calm." And I would always think, "Wow, you should have seen me yesterday." Ask my wife. And in fact, during my recovery, I've had to go back for therapy, not once, but twice, with dealing with anger. So I'm so grateful to you that you were so kind to share that with me. That made me feel more human. Because sometimes I would even sometimes think, gosh, I'm a fake. And that's not true. So much of what you said this evening resonated with me. And so much as well as that we're kind of a work in progress. I didn't like that, but the way you explain things this evening, it's kind of give me a lot of hope. And I will finish on this. I have a bad habit of never finishing when I say I will. But you mentioned about sources of joy. And that was lovely. The way you said it was really, really lovely. I was thinking, yeah, that's what I want for my recovery. Life can be tough on life's terms, but it's a good thing for me to constantly look for some sources of joy rather than feeling guilty for it. I'm really grateful to you. I'm grateful to everybody who's organized this evening. It's been absolutely wonderful, and I can't wait to read your book. Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks again to everyone.
All right, thanks,
John,
Brendan.
can I
Thanks,
jump in?
Brendan.
There was a question in the chat that was there right at the beginning. So I just thought maybe we could put Carl back to work. And it is about the use or overuse of the word addiction, where everything is an addiction, sugar's an addiction, spending's an addiction, so on and so forth. I know there were a bunch of lobbyists that wanted certain things in the DMS-5 that were disappointed that sex addiction and that sort of thing wasn't included. And then there's Russell Brand that considers consumerism all a part of an addictive cycle. But can you speak to, what limits, if any, we should use on that word, or how you might feel about that for this particular questioner?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I missed that comment. But I also want to say it's so great to be here, and I really appreciate everyone sharing. And it's so lovely to be in a Zoom with people committed to addiction and recovery. It's really a lovely community you have here. Pardon me. just to keep it very brief, because I could go on for ages about this. The word addiction has a more than 500-year-old history in English alone. And it comes from the Latin, where it also had deep, deep, deep roots. And it wasn't a meaningless word. It had very powerful connotations around power and powerlessness, and even some like mystical connotations like augury, but also enslavement and the relationship of the will to self-control and personal choice. And it's precisely that reason all of those complicated connotations that were associated with the Latin meanings of addiction that was brought into the English language, mostly by Protestant writers and theologians who were really curious about this mystery, this paradox of like, why can't we do the good even when we want to? Why do people go toward what they know to be wrong? And then the word subsequently got narrowed and applied in various contexts, medically and otherwise, sometimes in contradictory ways. And so I don't think that there's one definitive truth to the word addiction. It's not that somebody writing the DSM, and I was on the editorial review board for the DSM for certain things, and like, listen, they're smart people, but they're just a bunch of people who are reading a text. I don't think that any guru or spiritual teacher has the truth of addiction either. It's a very flexible and complex word. But the thing about it that I really like is the notion of what people have called powerlessness. That sometimes the word addiction is used, to me, in a cavalier way that says, oh, if you use something a lot, or if you engage in something a lot, and then it causes problems, that's an addiction. Well, I don't know, not really. That wasn't really there in the original meaning of the word. People were using it to say that through my own choice, I experienced the loss of power. I experienced the inability to exercise my will. And that's also what the ancient Greeks were talking about. You mentioned akrasia and weakness of will, and the sort of spectrum of human self-control problems. So, I've met people who really struggle with eating in a profound way. And I don't mean to make light of it by talking about my own like cake, because I don't have diabetes, for example, but I've met people who say do have diabetes and they really want to change their habits, but then because of restlessness or pain or discomfort or some other problems in other parts of their life, they really struggle to bring their actions in line with their intentions. And that to me is like an addiction. Whether or not they call it an addiction, whether or not they take on that identity for themselves, that's for them. I think a lot of what the addictive experience is like, it has to do with the subjective experience and one's own identity formulation. Again, Owen Flanagan has written a lot about this. So I'm very comfortable making the diagnosis of substance use disorder because that's what the diagnosis is designed for in a clinical context. But I think in most cases, you'll find that addiction relies on somebody's own personal recognition. I am struggling with this. And so I think, 12-step tradition and other traditions have been good about this and cautioning people to not take other people's inventories and not say, don't tell somebody else when they have an addiction. That's in a way their own choice. So I don't know. There's a lot more I think we could say about the sort of extension of addiction and addictive like behaviors throughout society. In a way, I think there is a bit of addiction in all of us, in the way that it's a matter of degree and not kind, that there's nothing extraordinarily special or unique, like there's a neat line dividing people with addiction from the rest of the population. But at the same time, I feel like I'm special. Of course, I think I'm special. I think I'm special in the sense that I have membership in this club. Like I qualify as a person with addiction. I am far enough out on that spectrum. I shouldn't drink again. Okay, fine. That spectrum might be directly contiguous with the rest of human experience. Okay, fine. I don't know quite how to make sense of that, but like I'm enough over on this end that it makes sense to me. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I got.
All right, thanks. We also have a question in the chat, which perhaps you'd like to address if you've had a chance to read it. He says, what thoughts you have on what role spirituality should play in addiction treatment and research, recognizing the many instances it can be weaponized in treatment. It can also resist reducing the person to a model of biological determinism, which justifies controlling and manipulative therapies, as well as policies like the war on drugs.
Yeah. This is a tremendous question, honestly. It's, I think, a big tension in mental health treatment. Because even within models of psychotherapy, you can see debates, or I should say across models of psychotherapy, you can see debates about the role that values and morality should play in treatment. And to my mind, in the types of really solid psychotherapies, including quality evidence-based psychotherapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, there is a role for values, and there's a role for clarifying people's values and helping them move toward values and goals and aims. So that's, that's only one tiny little portion of what might traditionally be called religion or spirituality. I totally agree that the notion of spirituality can be weaponized in treatment. And I also think that a biologically reductionistic conception of what makes a person tick can also be weaponized and be dehumanizing and sap people's hope. And yeah, for me, the notion of surrender and taking a leap of faith into even just a community outside of myself, in trusting that others who had walked this path before me could help me in a way that I could not do for myself, was immensely powerful. And there's a way that that's not spiritual, and the way that is spiritual. So I don't know how to legislate or regulate spirituality in treatment. For me, that dimension of care is the human dimension, and it comes from just people meeting in community and working their best to be good healers and good systems of treatment and care. But at the very least, just by recognizing that the buck doesn't stop with biology, that there's more, that there's more to the biological level, and we also need to appreciate it at a humanistic and a social, and maybe you could say transcendent. I don't know, maybe that works in a secular worldview, maybe not, but we need something beyond just sort of strict behaviorism. Even just opening the door to that possibility and that sort of diversity of perspectives on addiction, I think would be a good step.
All right. Dale, actually, can we try and see if Derek can get in again? You'll have to unmute.
Can you hear?
Hey, all right.
Hey, I just had to change platform. I dared turn on my camera because I don't know what's happening. The internet's acting up. It's rare for me. Actually, it's great. I love the talk. I suppose I've got a few questions. And I suppose I've been around a while, in abstinence. I'm quite relaxed about, I know some people in AA use grass to keep their anxiety low. Hey, look, they're not causing problems. So, but I suppose it's like this. I'm a keen observer of maths and stuff like this in my career. And most of what you call the rehab industrial complex, if you look at it, the recovery, if you say recovery after 1 year, is pretty shocking. AAs isn't even that good, really. And I suppose it leads to my question, Doctor, is that, because you've read this and you're closer to it than me, what's your viewpoints on the Sinclair Method? Because I've read a lot about that and studies on it. And it does seem to me that even good old Bill Wilson said maybe science will come up with something for alcoholism. Currently, the Finns incorporate the Sinclair Method in their National Health Service. And they have a claim of 78% recovery rate on alcoholism. It's not as effective with other drugs, but with alcoholism, it is. But I don't know when you're writing your book if you looked into that, because it's interesting that I'm based in the UK, never gets recommended by the NHS, and I'm now based in Ireland and never gets recommended by the HSE, which again, at the end of the day, I'm not going to get involved with words like addiction and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, we could spend all day talking about words. But if you looked into that on your research for the book, I'm just intrigued with something that looks like it's a very, very successful methodology to treat alcoholism. It's so not widely accepted or known about, even in the medical profession. And it was one of your scholars that brought it to us.
Yeah, it's a great question. I should say that the Sinclair Method is the notion of using oral naltrexone before one drinks. And naltrexone is definitely underprescribed. I think there are a lot of ways that certain psychiatric medications are overprescribed, and then medications for substance use problems are drastically underprescribed, both for opioid use disorders, but also alcohol use disorders. And it's not just naltrexone. There are other medications that could be really helpful too. And it's interesting in the history, and it's not all about 12-step, but in the early history of 12-step groups, there was quite a bit of receptiveness to medication treatments. It's on my reading. And while at the same time recognizing the sort of double-edged sword of certain medications like barbiturates, which are sort of an early class of sedative. And you could read the grapevine from, say, early 1950s, and before the general public or even the medical profession had a sense that barbiturates could be a problem. There were people saying like, oh, some people with alcoholism, they get put on barbiturates and then they wind up using it in a problematic way. So it's not to say that medications are an unvarnished good, because we've been blindsided by that notion over and over and over again throughout history. But there is, I think, a sort of ideological stigma against medications in recovery, as if it's not quote unquote clean. And it's really harmful, and it's an even bigger problem, in my view, and here I'll just kick the hornet's nest at 7 minutes left in the meeting, when we're talking about methadone and buprenorphine, the opioid agonists for the treatment of opioid use disorder. And the best big scale studies that we have say that those two medications are the only ones that have really solid evidence for preventing death. They're the only ones that really move the needle in terms of stopping death, in terms of the risk of overdose. Now, we all know there's a difference between stopping a death and saving a life. Those things are related. And, once you get somebody on a sort of treatment program that keeps them from overdosing, that's not the end of the battle, and there's still more to do. But because of stigma that, again, I don't think has a root in any sort of mutual help recovery lesson. It more comes from the social and cultural baggage against these medications. We vastly underutilize these medications. And the last thing about the Sinclair Method specifically is that sometimes I think proponents of the Sinclair Method treat it like it's panacea, like, oh, if anybody would use this, then they'll be fine. And that's just not what I find. That's not what the evidence shows. That I don't know. I mean, we could look at the research, but like 70-80% sounds a little high to me. It probably speaks to the diversity of addiction problems that, for some people, it scratches some neurochemical itch and works really well. And then for other people, it doesn't work at all. I've seen it work for people. I've seen it not work for people. We just need more options, I think, in addiction treatment. Options in terms of varieties of recovery experience in general, and options in terms of different models of medical treatment as well.
Thanks. I just have to say the other thing that really is unfortunate about buprenorphine is that it's almost impossible for doctors to get it. And once they get it, they can only treat a small number of patients. And it's also an excellent pain reliever without the addictive, a lot of the problems with opioids have, because it's sort of a partial antagonist as well as anyway, just my own personal bugaboo about that. Dale?
Hey folks, I just want to thank you, Dr. Fisher, for all of your efforts in advancing the knowledge of addiction and recovery. All of this scientific and medical information is only going to improve our ability to reach the addicts and our success rates within recovery. And that's huge. I mean, I don't know how much you feel that you're doing for us, but what you're doing, what I think you're doing, is huge, absolutely huge. And we've had a great run with the old models. We've done okay, but with the advancements in our knowledge, we're just going to get better and better. And for that, I'm very grateful for all of your efforts. Thank you. That's all I got.
Thanks, Dale. Okay, Kevin, got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, hi. I'm an alcoholic, and after 23 years of recovery, channeling my inner Jeb, I now have 2,557 days today, which turns out to be exactly 7 years. Yay! Anyway, so for me, and my lesson out of that I got early on from a treatment counselor was, as long as I keep coming back, he generalized it to, as long as people keep coming back, that they will always eventually get it. And in my case, that turned out to be both a blessing and true. And that's like the most important thing in my life, is that I need to keep coming back. But so I was going to put it to you, as Carl, the alcoholic, and Dr. Fisher, the knowledgeable guy. What's the most important things you know for people to stay and get back to recovery? Thanks.
I'm totally stumped. I don't know, Kevin. It's very nice of you to ask, but the thing that comes to mind, because you said it, is to keep trying. To keep coming back. Keep coming back can mean keep coming back to something that's not working for you too. So I think we have to hold that loosely, because sometimes people need other supports. Sometimes people need a different model, and then they come back around to the first model. Who knows? But I think that we underestimate just how much hope and capacity for change there is in addiction. The stereotype is that people are broken, that will never change, that there's something unfixably wrong with us. And it's just not true. Some of those big scale studies that we were talking about before say that most people with substance use problems recover, and that there's often an initial dip in people's sense of well-being and happiness, but then on average, it's different for different people, but on average around the 6-month mark, people tend to experience really positive changes in well-being, self-esteem, functioning in the world. And of course, we all know that can be a rocky course. You can have a down day or a down month or a down year, but to keep trying and to counteract the negative stigma and the negative expectations, I think, is a really important and powerful thing that we need to do in a world where so few people ever get the opportunity to recover, so few people ever get the opportunity to connect with a helping hand, whether it's a mutual help recovery group or medical treatment or whatever else. So, congrats on your 7 years. It's huge. Thanks.
All right. Eric, did you want to share?
I want to thank you all for your shares and your experience. I just did jot down my own experience was that, and it's been recent that for me, my recovery, I was 38 years, May 5th, started with me knowing that I was very ignorant about whatever you want to call it, the malady, the disease. But for me, one thing I had to do, and I wasn't in secular, but instead of using the term character defect, which is totally a moralistic statement to me, I went to the idea that I was maladjusted, because it gave me hope that I could be readjusted, because I, prior to ever really drinking, and I really have had to go back, like most of us, and look at how my defense mechanisms were or will come into play to trigger the need to anesthetize. In the matter of, again, being maladjusted, it means I can be readjusted, which is hopeful. And that's what I've gotten in this year. And thank you for what you have done here and you're doing as far as dealing with ignorance. So thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that we do often stay a little bit longer, and I know that our guest speaker may need to leave. I don't know, but I wanted to just remind everybody that and thank Kat for being support for this, and Joe for always being present. I really appreciate it, and so does the Freethinkers Group, which he is a part of, but he's an adjunct part of our group. The Freethinkers Group next month will present another Varieties on the last Sunday. We haven't quite gotten it set yet, but we're thinking about maybe how alcoholism is kind of like an octopus, with multiple arms, and once you chop off one of the other ones pops up. And if you have any suggestions, or if you'd like to give us some input, the email address is in the chat box. I just want to remind everybody the opinions expressed here tonight are strictly those, or today, those who gave them. And what you've heard is spoken in confidence, so it should be treated as such. We share to help each other and ourselves. So we always try and welcome everybody's experience, strength, and hope. And many of us have found when we consider what we've heard with an open mind and a heart, we gain a better understanding of ourselves and each other. And we also learn how to handle our day-to-day problems better. At least I have. Since members often share both trials and triumphs with each other, please let there be no gossip or criticism, but just love and appreciation, and understanding and companionship. And we can, as I said, if others wanted to take an opportunity to say something they didn't get a chance to, now would be the time, or forever hold your peace. Well, maybe not forever. Okay, well, the way we like to end our meeting is the usual way. If you would care to join in, you can unmute and we do the responsibility declaration. Who's responsible?
I
am responsible
when
anyone, anywhere
reaches out for help, with the hand of AA, always to be there. For that, I am responsible. And thank you very much, Carl and Joe. And
Next rehearsal will be
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Joe.
We rehearse that at least once a month.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks, John.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone,
Carl.
so
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Joe and John.
Glad you were here.